Poetry is a form of literature that uses aesthetic and rhythmic qualities of language, such as phonaesthetics, sound symbolism, and metre, to evoke meanings in addition to, or in place of, the prosaic ostensible meaning. Poetry has a long history, dating back to the Sumerian Epic of Gilgamesh. Early poems evolved from folk songs such as the Chinese Shijing, or from a need to retell oral epics, as with the Sanskrit Vedas, Zoroastrian Gathas, and the Homeric epics, the Iliad and the Odyssey. Ancient attempts to define poetry, such as Aristotle's Poetics, focused on the uses of speech in rhetoric, drama, song and comedy. Later attempts concentrated on features such as repetition, verse form and rhyme, and emphasized the aesthetics which distinguish poetry from more objectively informative, prosaic forms of writing. For the mid-20th century, poetry has sometimes been more generally regarded as a fundamental creative act employing language. Poetry uses forms and conventions to suggest differential interpretation to words, or to evoke emotive responses. Devices such as assonance, alliteration, onomatopoeia and rhythm are sometimes used to achieve musical or incantatory effects. The use of ambiguity, symbolism, irony and other stylistic elements of poetic diction often leaves a poem open to multiple interpretations. Similarly, figures of speech such as metaphor, simile and metonymy create a resonance between otherwise disparate images, a layering of meanings, forming connections previously not perceived. Kindred forms of resonance may exist between individual verses, in the patterns of rhyme or rhythm. Some poetry types are specific to particular cultures and genres and respond to characteristics of the language in which the poet writes. Readers accustomed to identifying poetry with Dante, Goethe, Mickiewicz and Rumi may think of it as written in lines based on rhyme and regular meter. There are, however, traditions, such as biblical poetry, that use other means to create rhythm and euphony. Much modern poetry reflects a critique of poetic tradition, playing with and testing, among other things, the principle of euphony itself, sometimes altogether foregoing rhyme as set rhythm. In today's increasingly globalized world, poets often adapt forms, styles and techniques from diverse cultures and languages. History. Poetry as an art form may predate literacy. The oldest surviving epic poem is the Epic of Gilgamesh, from the 3rd millennium BC in Sumer, which was written in cuneiform script on clay tablets and, later, papyrus. A tablet dating to c. 2000 BC describes an annual rite in which the king symbolically married and mated with the goddess Inanna to ensure fertility and prosperity, and is considered the world's oldest love poem. Examples of Egyptian epic poetry include the story of Cinea. Other ancient epic poetry includes the Greek epics Iliad and Odyssey, the Avestan books, the Gathic Avesta and Yashna, the Roman national epic, Virgil's Aeneid, and the Indian epics Ramayana and Mahabharata. Epic poetry, including the Indian Vedas, the Gathas, and the Odyssey, appears to have been composed in poetic form to aid memorization and oral transmission in prehistoric and ancient societies. Other forms of poetry developed directly from folk songs. The earliest entries in the ancient compilation Shijing were initially lyrics, preceding later entries intended to be read. The efforts of ancient thinkers to determine what makes poetry distinctive as a form, and what distinguishes good poetry from bad, resulted in Poetics, the study of the aesthetics of poetry. Some ancient poetic traditions, such as, contextually, classical Chinese poetry in the case of the Shijing, which records the development of poetic canons with ritual and aesthetic importance. More recently, thinkers have struggled to find a definition that could encompass formal differences as great as those between Chaucer's Canterbury Tales and Matsuo Basho's Oku no Hosomichi, as well as differences in context spanning Tanakh religious poetry, love poetry, and rap. Western traditions' classical thinkers employed classification as a way to define and assess the quality of poetry. Notably, the existing fragments of Aristotle's Poetics describe three genres of poetry: the epic, the comic, and the tragic, and develop rules to distinguish the highest quality poetry in each genre, based on the underlying purposes of the genre. Later aestheticians identified three major genres: epic poetry, lyric poetry, and dramatic poetry, treating comedy and tragedy as subgenres of dramatic poetry. Aristotle's work was influential throughout the Middle East during the Islamic Golden Age, as well as in Europe during the Renaissance. Later poets and aestheticians often distinguished poetry from, and defined it in opposition to prose, which was generally understood as writing with a proclivity to logical explication and a linear narrative structure. This does not imply that poetry is illogical or lacks narration, but rather that poetry is an attempt to render the beautiful or sublime without the burden of engaging the logical or narrative thought process. English Romantic poet John Keats termed this escape from logic negative capability. This Romantic approach views form as a key element of successful poetry because form is abstract and distinct from the underlying notional logic. This approach remained influential into the 20th century. During this period, there was also substantially more interaction among the various poetic traditions, in part due to the spread of European colonialism and the attendant rise in global trade. In addition to a boom in translation, during the Romantic period numerous ancient works were rediscovered. 20th century and 21st century disputes. Some 20th century literary theorists, relying less on the opposition of prose and poetry, focused on the poet is simply one who creates using language, and poetry as what the poet creates. The underlying concept of the poet as creator is not uncommon, and some modernist poets essentially do not distinguish between the creation of a poem with words and creative acts in other media. Yet other modernists challenged the very attempt to define poetry as misguided. The rejection of traditional forms and structures for poetry that began in the first half of the 20th century coincided with a questioning of the purpose and meaning of traditional definitions of poetry and of distinctions between poetry and prose, particularly given examples of poetic prose and prosaic poetry. Numerous modernist poets have written in non-traditional forms or in what traditionally would have been considered prose, although the writing was generally infused with poetic diction and often with rhythm and tone established by non-metrical means. While there was a substantial formalist reaction within the modernist schools to the breakdown of structure, this reaction focused as much on the development of new formal structures and syntheses as on the revival of older forms and structures. Recently, postmodernism has come to convey more completely prose and poetry as distinct entities, and also among genres of poetry, as having meaning only as cultural artifacts. Postmodernism goes beyond modernism's emphasis on the creative role of the poet to emphasize the role of the reader of a text, and to highlight the complex cultural web within which a poem is read. Today, throughout the world, poetry often incorporates poetic form and diction from other cultures and from the past, further confounding attempts at definition and classification that were once sensible within a tradition such as the Western canon. The early 21st century poetic tradition appears to continue to strongly orient itself to earlier precursor poetic traditions such as those initiated by Whitman, Emerson, and Wordsworth. The literary critic Jeffrey Harmon has used the phrase "the anxiety of demand" to describe contemporary response to older poetic traditions as being fearful that a fact no longer has a form, building on a trope introduced by Emerson. Emerson had maintained that in the debate concerning poetic structure where either form or fact could predominate, that one need simply ask the fact for the form. Quote, "This has been challenged at various levels by other literary scholars such as Bloom, who has stated in summary form concerning the early 21st century that the generation of poets who stand together now, mature and ready to write the major American verse of the 21st century, may yet be seen as what Stevens called the great shadow's last embellishment, the shadow being Emerson's